She stepped off the stagecoach at 45, carrying nothing but a trunk, a tin of cookies, and a hope the world told her she was too old to hold on to. Rejected at the altar, humiliated in front of a town. But when one stranger spoke up, it wasn't the start of pity. It was the beginning of the greatest love story Durango had ever seen. Stay to the end, because what happened next will rewrite everything you thought you knew about second chances. When society shut the door, she left it ajar with dignity. They say it's foolish to expect miracles at 45, that love has an expiration date, and dignity is best kept quiet. But when Eleanor Hayes stepped off the stagecoach in Durango, Colorado, in the winter of 1882, she wasn't looking for a miracle. She only hoped the ground beneath her feet might be steadier than the years behind her. What she didn't know was that her name was about to be whispered across town. Not for what she lacked, but for something she hadn't known she still carried: fire. Her arrival was not marked by fanfare. One trunk, one hatbox, one carefully folded letter, creased from being read too many times. The cold mountain air nipped at her cheeks as she gazed at the town. Modest buildings dusted with snow, windows flickering with lamplight, and strangers who stole glances but offered no smiles. Durango was not a place that made room easily, especially not for a woman who had waited so long to claim space of her own. Eleanor had once been a schoolteacher in Denver, a good one. She'd spent her best years spelling out futures for children whose parents forgot their names by nightfall. When her own parents fell ill, she did what was expected. She gave up the schoolroom, her ambitions, her suitors. Time moved on without her. Friends married, babies were born, and Eleanor stayed. Until one day she stood in a quiet parlor with no more goodbyes to give, and realized the world didn't have a place set for her anymore. But Eleanor was not done. She'd clipped a small ad from the back of a New Mexico Gazette. A widower named Franklin Dent, a businessman, respectable, alone, sought a practical, honest woman for a life of companionship and shared work. Eleanor's response was deliberate, her words chosen like seeds. Educated, even-tempered, domestic. I seek kindness above all. The letters came, steady, polite, reassuring. Not love letters, but anchors. She allowed herself the tiniest of hopes. She baked molasses cookies because Franklin once mentioned he liked them. She bought a used mirror and studied her own reflection in it, not with vanity, but with a kind of negotiation. What could still be offered, and what must be accepted. Her hair, streaked silver. Her hands, worn but steady. Her heart, a house long locked but still intact. With her savings, Eleanor bought a new skirt and jacket. Navy wool, modest but tailored. She had one good dress left, pale blue cotton with lace at the collar. She pressed it carefully, folded it with trembling hands, and packed it beside her dreams. The journey to Durango was long and jarring, but each mile felt like peeling back years of stillness. The boarding house was clean and quiet. Her room, small but warm. The town, curious and cautious. Eleanor sensed the unspoken question behind every glance. Why now? She didn't answer aloud, but her presence was an answer. Because hope had not died. Because kindness was still a reason. Because maybe, just maybe, this could still be her time. But something felt strange. Franklin hadn't met her at the stagecoach stop. He sent a note instead, asking to meet at St. Joseph's Church in 2 days. The arrangements are in order, it said. Please wear your dress. Alone in her room that night, Eleanor held the note with both hands. Her fingers trembled, not from cold but from uncertainty. Was it nerves, excitement, or the sense, deep and ancient, that something was already slipping out of place? She couldn't know then that the church steps would be where her life would unspool and rethread itself entirely. On her second day in Durango, Eleanor walked through town in silence. The general store clerks murmured. Children stared. A pair of older women paused mid-step to study her. The whispers weren't cruel, not yet, but they carried the scent of skepticism. "Is that her?" one voice asked behind her. Bless her heart, still hoping at her age. Eleanor didn't turn. She walked taller. The truth was she'd asked herself that same question, but she'd also answered it. Yes. Still hoping, still standing, still here. That evening, she took her dress from its box and shook out the folds. She lit a single candle and stood before the mirror. She fastened the button slowly, remembering how it once fit her snug at the waist. Now it hung looser. She didn't mind. The years had taken from her, yes, but they had also given wisdom, quiet strength, a certain kind of grace that can't be taught in youth. The next morning, Eleanor rose before dawn. She braided her hair and pinned it in place. She tucked the molasses cookies into a small tin, not sure if Franklin would remember, but she did. As the church bells rang, she stepped out into the chill with one final breath, and she walked toward something she believed would be the end of her solitude, unaware that it would instead become the beginning of a story people in Durango would tell for years to come. Not because it ended in heartbreak, but because it revealed something no one expected. What happens when a woman the world calls too old dares to live like she's just getting started? When she was left at the altar, she chose dignity over despair. The church bell struck 9 as Eleanor stepped onto Main Street, the sound echoing like a solemn warning through the crisp mountain air. Her heart pounded against her ribs, not with excitement but with something heavier, a feeling she couldn't quite name. St. Joseph's Church stood at the end of the street, small and bright white, like a promise, or a trap. She walked steadily, her blue cotton dress brushing softly against her legs. The lace collar itched, but she ignored it. Her shoes, polished to a shine, pinched slightly. She had worn them only once before, for her father's funeral. As she approached, she noticed the crowd. More people than she'd expected for a quiet wedding. Strangers leaned on wooden posts, whispered behind gloved hands, and stared openly as she passed. Some wore curiosity like a new hat, others pity. "She's the one," someone murmured. "The lady from Denver. Bless her heart, doesn't she know?" Eleanor kept walking. Every step forward was a refusal to shrink. She mounted the church steps slowly, her hands curled around the tin of cookies she'd baked just for him. Franklin Dent waited near the door with Reverend Thomas. His posture was stiff, his eyes darting like a man watching for a train he didn't want to catch. She offered a gentle smile. "Franklin," she said, "you look well." He blinked. "Eleanor, yes, these flowers." He looked down at the modest bouquet in his hand, as if surprised to find it there. Then back up at her. His eyes didn't hold warmth, they held panic. "About today," he began, "about everything. I need to say something." She felt the first crack, not in his voice but in the moment, the way the world shifted around her, the way the sunlight suddenly felt too sharp. "I've thought a lot about this," Franklin continued, "about what marriage is, what it's for, and I realize now that this arrangement won't work." The tin in her hands felt suddenly very heavy. "I can't marry a woman past childbearing years," he said, the words landing like gunshots in the still morning air. "It wouldn't be practical. I'm sorry, Eleanor." There was a collective intake of breath. Even the birds seemed to go quiet. She didn't move, didn't cry. Instead, she inhaled once, slowly, as if drawing breath through stone. "I see," she said, her voice low but steady. "May I ask what changed?" Franklin stammered, looking everywhere but at her. "You're just not what I imagined." "What did you imagine?" she asked, her gaze calm. "Someone younger," he finally admitted. "Someone who could give him children. Someone less complicated, less seasoned." The whispers grew louder. Eleanor heard them all, the cutting comments, the condescension wrapped in concern. She should have known better. 45? And still dreaming? Poor dear, how humiliating. But she did not flinch. Instead, Eleanor stepped forward, standing tall in front of the man who had written to her of respect, who now spoke only of function and fertility. "You want a broodmare," she said clearly, "not a wife." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "You wrote to me, Franklin. You know my mind, my values. You called me thoughtful, intelligent, capable. But all that vanished the moment you remembered my age." Franklin opened his mouth, but no sound came. She turned then, not just to leave, but to face the crowd. "For anyone wondering," she said, her voice stronger now, echoing off the stone walls, "this is what rejection looks like when it wears the clothes of reason, when age becomes an accusation, when dignity is met with dismissal." They stared, some with shame, others with smug satisfaction. Eleanor met their eyes anyway, and then, just as she took her first step down from the altar, a voice rang out. Deep, certain. "Then let me marry her." Everything stopped. Heads turned. A man stood at the edge of the crowd, tall, broad-shouldered, in a worn coat and dust-covered boots. His eyes were the color of rich soil, and they held no mockery, only calm. "My name's Jesse Callahan," he said, removing his hat, "and I can see what she's worth." Franklin's face flushed deep red. "This is madness. This is a private affair." "It was," Jesse said, "until you made it public, until you humiliated a good woman in front of half the town." Eleanor blinked, stunned. She had never seen this man before. Yet he stood there as if sent by something older and truer than time. Reverend Thomas looked between them, bewildered. "Sir, this is highly irregular." Jesse nodded. "So is what just happened, but if you've got no legal objection, and if Miss Hayes agrees, I'm offering a name and a home to a woman who deserves better." Silence. Then all eyes turned to Eleanor. She looked at Jesse. This stranger. This man who hadn't written her letters or made false promises, but who, in 5 minutes, had seen what Franklin never could. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I've seen too many good people thrown away for the wrong reasons," he replied, "and I won't stand by while it happens again." The tin of cookies dropped from her hands. Not out of despair, but because for the first time in years, they were no longer needed. Something sweeter had just been offered. And Eleanor, the woman once called too old to dream, stood tall on those church steps and said yes, not just to Jesse, but to a life she thought had passed her by. What began in rejection was about to unfold into something more powerful than romance, more enduring than infatuation. It would be called love, the kind that sees you, not in spite of your age, but because of everything it taught you to become, not out of pity, but out of admiration. The church steps had never witnessed anything quite like it. One man walking away in shame, and another stepping forward with honor. As Eleanor stood beside Jesse Callahan with the eyes of Durango fixed upon them, it felt as if time had split in two, before and after. Before, a life lived in sacrifice and silence. After, the beginning of something uncharted, uncertain, and entirely her own. The ceremony was brief, the vows simple. Eleanor's hand trembled only once, when Jessie slipped the thin gold band onto her finger and looked into her eyes without blinking. There was no poetry, no grand declarations, only one sentence that stayed with her. "We'll get to know each other proper if you'll let me." And with that, Eleanor Hayes became Eleanor Callahan. They rode in silence out of town in Jesse's wagon, the wooden wheels creaking against the frozen earth. Eleanor sat upright, her hands clasped in her lap, her wedding dress now speckled with dust from the road. Jesse didn't speak much. He handled the reins with steady hands and stole occasional glances her way, as if trying to make sense of this woman he'd just married. The journey to his ranch took over 2 hours. Paradise Valley stretched out before them like a secret whispered only to those brave enough to listen. Rolling hills, sunlit meadows, a slow river that curled like ribbon through the land. When they arrived, Eleanor's breath caught. The house wasn't large, but it was sturdy, built with care and patience. A porch wrapped around the front. Smoke curled from the chimney. It didn't shout. It welcomed. Jesse helped her down, carrying her trunk inside with ease. He opened the door to a warm, lived-in space. A modest kitchen, a sitting room with a worn armchair, and 2 bedrooms down a short hall. "This one's yours," he said gently, placing her things in the larger of the 2 rooms. "Figured we'd take our time, no expectations, just start where we are." It was the kindest thing he could have said. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. The first days passed in a rhythm neither of them planned, but both respected. Jesse rose early, tending cattle, mending fences. Eleanor swept, unpacked, organized. She found comfort in small things, folding linens, kneading bread dough, arranging wildflowers in a chipped jar. Jesse returned each evening smelling of horses and wind, always with something to share. A funny story about the neighbor's stubborn mule, a comment on the weather, a new thought about the fence line. They ate dinner together at the same worn table, side by side. At first, the conversation was polite, even stiff, but one night Jesse asked, "What was it like? Teaching children all those years?" And Eleanor found herself speaking for over an hour about chalk dust, laughter, and the ache of watching students outgrow the classroom while she stayed behind. He listened, really listened. Not the way Franklin had pretended to listen in his letters, but the way someone listens when they're building something. Days grew longer. Eleanor ventured into the garden, pulling weeds, planning where vegetables might grow come spring. Jesse brought her a basket one afternoon, filled with tools, gloves, seeds. "Got 'em from Mrs. Perkins down the road. Figured you might want to start." It wasn't romance, but it was something better. Attentiveness. They learned each other's habits. She hummed while she worked. He whittled when he was thinking. She liked to read after supper. He liked to sit on the porch with coffee before dawn, and in between the routines and the silences something began to grow. Not a fire, a flame, steady, undeniable. Then, one evening, Jesse brought out a faded photograph of his mother. "She was older than my father when they married," he said quietly. "Folks said it wouldn't work, that she'd never give him a family. They were wrong." Eleanor traced the edges of the photo. The woman's eyes were kind, worn but wise. "You looked at me like you'd seen her ghost that day at the church," Eleanor murmured. Jesse nodded. "I saw strength and something else, dignity that doesn't ask permission." The words settled deep in her chest. It had been years since anyone saw her that clearly. Maybe no one ever had. Weeks passed. The world didn't stop for their new marriage. It just gave them room to find their pace. One day, after working side by side in the barn, Eleanor laughed at something Jesse said. Really laughed, the kind that bubbled up from a place she thought had gone dry. Jesse turned and stared for a moment before saying, "That's a good sound. You ought to do that more." It was the most intimate moment they'd shared. There were no grand gestures, no moonlit dances, but there were hands reaching instinctively for each other in the kitchen. There were cups of coffee left ready on the table before dawn. There were 2 sets of boots by the door, not one. And there was a woman who, for the first time in decades, went to bed without apologizing for who she was. She didn't know yet if she loved him. But she knew this. Jesse Callahan saw her not as a placeholder, not as a last chance, but as someone worth choosing. Not out of pity, but out of admiration. And sometimes that's where love begins. Not in the heat of passion, but in the warmth of being truly seen. Storms tested them, but respect rooted them. It wasn't the wedding, the vows, or even the unexpected tenderness that revealed the strength of Eleanor and Jesse's union. It was what came after, the storms, both literal and unseen, that turned their quiet beginning into a bond forged through fire. In the high country, life has a way of revealing truth without ceremony, and that spring, the truth arrived cloaked in ice. The storm came out of nowhere. One week, warm winds and early buds gave hope to a gentler season. The next, snow blanketed the land with a vengeance rarely seen outside the depths of winter. Trees cracked like gunfire in the cold, and the wind howled through the valley with the fury of 1,000 unanswered prayers. Jesse was out checking on the cattle when the blizzard hit. Eleanor waited by the window, heart pounding as visibility dropped to mere feet. Hours passed. Dusk turned the snow from white to gray. When Jesse finally staggered into the house, half frozen and limping, he collapsed by the fire, his arm cradling a bloodied side. He'd slipped, broken a rib, maybe 2, and still managed to rope in a frightened calf before dragging himself home. Eleanor didn't panic. She fetched the whiskey and the needle. She boiled water and made a poultice of herbs she'd learned about from an old Cherokee woman back in Denver. She fed him broth by the spoonful, and when he winced from the pain, she held his hand until he slept. For 2 weeks, the ranch belonged to her. She fed the animals, mucked the stalls, shoveled snow from the roof, and mended the back fence. She even learned to fire Jesse's old rifle to scare off a coyote lurking too close to the chicken coop. Neighbors offered help, but she declined it. Not out of pride, but because she needed to know she could stand in the storm if it came again. The cold seeped into her bones, but it couldn't reach the warmth of her resolve. Every morning, she woke up sore, tired, and determined. Her hands blistered, her back ached, and still she stood. Jesse, meanwhile, healed slowly. He hated feeling useless, hated watching from the window while Eleanor worked the land alone. But he also admired her more deeply than he ever had anyone. He began to realize that what he'd done, what they'd both done, wasn't just marry each other. They had made a choice to build something together. And now, Eleanor was proving herself not just as a partner, but as the strongest person he'd ever known. When Jesse was finally able to walk without assistance, he looked around the ranch in awe. "You didn't just keep it going," he said softly. "You made it better." The admiration in his voice touched something tender in her. It wasn't just gratitude, it was respect. Not the polite nods given out of obligation, but the deep kind, a recognition of equal ground. She'd heard praise before, but never like this. Never from someone who truly understood the price of the work. And just when the storm seemed to be passing, another shadow returned. Franklin Dent. He arrived on horseback, thinner than before, his coat worn, his expression drawn. Eleanor was in the garden, tending to her newly planted vegetables. Jesse saw him first. "What do you want?" Jesse asked, stepping out onto the porch. Franklin took off his hat. "I came to speak with Eleanor." "She's busy," Jesse said. But Eleanor had already risen, wiping her hands on her apron as she walked toward the porch. "It's all right," she said. "Let him speak." Franklin's eyes shifted between them. "I was wrong," he said. "Back then, I see it now. I let fear and foolish pride make a decision I regret every day. I'm asking if you might reconsider." Eleanor blinked, stunned for only a second. Then she smiled, not cruelly, but with the gentle firmness of a woman who had finally come home to herself. "Reconsider," she echoed. "You made yourself clear, Franklin. You wanted youth, fertility, a guarantee. And now, what? Now that you've seen what a woman like me can build, now that you're alone again, I've suddenly become suitable." Franklin opened his mouth, but no words came. "I wish you well," she said simply, "but I'm exactly where I belong." Franklin left with his head bowed, and Jessie, who had stood quietly behind her, reached for her hand. "You handled that better than I ever could have." Eleanor smiled. "I wasn't defending myself. I was affirming who I've become. Life didn't slow after that. If anything, it demanded more of them. The fence needed rebuilding. The garden needed more care. And they needed to keep showing up for each other, not just in hardship, but in the quiet hours when life tested not their bodies but their hearts. They leaned into their work, side by side. Jessie with his hands in the soil, Eleanor with her arms full of laundry, eggs, and purpose. Jessie never spoke of love in grand speeches, but he showed it in the way he left the best piece of cornbread on her plate, the way he asked her opinion on every decision about the ranch, and the way his eyes lingered just a little longer when she walked into a room. Love, for him, was not a matter of saying, it was of seeing. And she saw him too. Saw how he gave space to her voice. Saw how he stood behind her, not over her. Saw how his silences carried as much meaning as his words. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip low behind the hills, Jessie turned to her and said, "I used to think strength meant not needing anyone. But now I see. It's knowing who to trust and letting them help you carry the weight." Eleanor nodded. "And not being ashamed to lean when you're tired." They didn't fall in love the way young people did, in a rush, with fire and thunder. They settled into it, like hands finding each other in the dark, like roots sinking quietly into the earth. What grew between them wasn't flashy or loud. It was enduring. It was honest. And though the storm had passed, something had changed. Something had taken root that no wind could pull loose. What began with uncertain vows on a church step had become a shelter stronger than stone. Respect, partnership, and a love that knew the cost of silence, the price of endurance, and the joy of being chosen not once, but every single day. 45. Wasn't the end, it was her beginning. 2 years had passed since that icy morning on the church steps, when Eleanor Hayes said, "I do," to a man she barely knew, in front of a town that barely understood her. What began in uncertainty had become something extraordinary, not because it followed a plan, but because it broke every expectation with quiet grace. The valley had changed, the ranch had grown, but most strikingly, so had Eleanor. One warm afternoon, Eleanor stood on the porch and gazed out over the land. The house was now larger by one full room and a wraparound porch Jessie had built the summer before. The vegetable garden had tripled in size. A dozen fruit trees were beginning to blossom, promising a harvest neither of them had dared dream of when they first stood together as husband and wife. There were chickens clucking near the coop and fresh sheets drying on the line. It was not wealth, not in the way city folk measured it, but it was abundance, and it was hers. Eleanor had grown into her new name with quiet confidence. She dressed in well-fitted cotton instead of the stiff gowns she once saved for important days. Her hair, now silver, was braided simply down her back, and her hands bore the signs of real work, scarred, calloused, strong. There was nothing girlish about her anymore. There was only the dignity of a woman who had earned her peace. Inside the house, on a shelf Jesse built with his own hands, were letters, dozens of them, sent to Eleanor from women across the state. Word of her unusual wedding and surprising marriage had spread. Some people gossiped, but others, especially women of a certain age, had sent their stories. "I thought it was too late for me, too," one wrote, "until I read what you did." Another, "Thank you for reminding me I don't need permission to hope." Jesse never commented on the letters. He simply handed them to her when they arrived, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, as if he understood the ripple of what they'd created. That night, as they sat by the fire, he with his boots off, she knitting in her rocker, Jesse shifted slightly in his chair. "There's something I've been meaning to say," he said. Eleanor looked up, her needles still. "Yes? When I married you that day, I thought I was doing a good thing. Noble, maybe. I thought I was helping someone who'd been wronged." Eleanor waited. She could feel something more coming. "But I've come to realize," Jesse said slowly, "that you weren't the one in need of saving." "I was. I didn't know it then, but I see it now. You didn't just bring warmth into this house. You brought depth, you brought balance, you brought peace." Eleanor blinked back tears. Not because the words were flowery, they weren't, but because they were real. And she had waited a lifetime to be spoken to like this. Jesse leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Eleanor, I love you. Not because I married you, but because I've watched you grow into this life, because you made it home, because you see me, and you let me see you." She didn't answer right away. She looked at the fire, at the shadows dancing on the walls, and remembered how many years she had spent simply surviving. She had been called a spinster, a leftover, a woman past her prime. But here, in this quiet house with this steady man, she had become something else entirely. "I love you too, Jesse," she said finally. "Not just for who you are, but for how you let me be myself without apology." He smiled and reached for her hand. They sat like that for a long time. Two people no longer searching, simply resting in the life they'd made. The next morning, Eleanor walked into town to deliver a parcel of vegetables and hand-sewn clothes to a family who'd recently lost their barn to fire. Along the way, several women stopped her. Some offered polite smiles, others quiet admiration. One younger woman, barely 20, pulled her aside and whispered, "I heard what you said that day at the church. I think about it all the time." Eleanor squeezed the girl's hand. "You don't have to be young to be worthy. You only have to be honest with yourself." Later that week, Jesse surprised her with a swing he'd built and hung from the oak tree beside the barn. When she stepped onto it, the wood creaked, but the chains held firm. She laughed, a full, deep laugh that startled a bird from the nearby fence. "I like the sound of that," Jesse said from the porch. She swung higher. Years ago, Eleanor would have worried about looking foolish. Now, she thought only of the breeze in her hair and the joy of the moment. One evening, they stood together by the corral, watching the sun set behind the hills. Jesse turned to her and said, "Do you regret anything?" Eleanor thought about all the years she'd spent alone, the proposals she'd turned down out of duty, the friends who pitied her, the near marriage to a man who never really saw her. "No," she said. "Every turn, every delay, it all brought me here, and I'd rather be loved late and rightly than early and wrong." Jesse didn't reply. He didn't need to. He pulled her close, kissed the top of her head, and they stood there in the stillness of a life neither of them had planned, but both had chosen. They had discovered the kind of love that doesn't fade with time. It deepens. It steadies. It arrives like spring after a long, hard winter, not all at once, but sure and unstoppable. Because the truth is, love doesn't always come wrapped in youth or tied in ribbons. Sometimes it shows up in work boots, with calloused hands and a quiet promise. Sometimes it comes not in the first chapter, but in the one you thought would be the last. And when it does, it changes everything. The Grace of Late-Bloomed Love. In a world that often rewards speed, youth, and immediacy, Eleanor Hayes's story reminds us of something far more profound, that love and fulfillment are not dictated by time, but by truth. From the moment she stepped off the stagecoach in Durango, Eleanor was not chasing romance. She was reclaiming her right to be seen, to be valued, to be chosen. And in doing so, she ignited something revolutionary, the belief that dignity does not expire. Her journey began not with promise but with uncertainty. A faded letter, a trunk of modest belongings, a dress folded with trembling hope. She arrived not as a bride-to-be, but as a woman clinging to the last thread of faith that kindness might still find her. And when that faith was met with public humiliation, when Franklin Dent rejected her not in private, but before the town, Eleanor did not shrink. She rose. Her words on that church step echoed with every woman who'd ever been told she was too old, too late, too much. And when Jesse Callahan stepped forward, not out of pity but respect, it wasn't a fairy tale rescue. It was the beginning of something rare, a partnership born in truth. Jesse and Eleanor didn't fall in love in a rush. They grew into it. Through silence, through shared meals, through days of mending fences and nights of quiet reflection. Their bond was not built on infatuation but on understanding. She, a woman long silenced. He, a man who valued steady strength over spectacle. Together, they planted something deeper than roots. They planted respect. When storms came, and they did, Eleanor didn't run. She stood, she shoveled snow, healed wounds, and held the land together. Not because she had to prove herself, but because that's who she was. And Jesse, watching from the porch as he healed, realized he hadn't saved her. She had saved them both. As months turned into years, their love didn't fade, it ripened. They built a home not just of wood and stone, but of letters from women inspired by Eleanor's courage, of conversations that reached deeper with time, of gestures that asked for nothing but gave everything. Jesse said it best. Eleanor didn't need rescuing, he did. In her, he found not a second chance, but a first time he truly understood partnership. And she, in his steady presence, found the one thing she had never dared to ask for, permission to be wholly, unapologetically herself. Their story is not dramatic in the usual sense. No outlaws, no gunfights. But make no mistake, Eleanor and Jesse were warriors. They fought against the expectations of age, against the scripts written for women past 40, against the myth that love is reserved for the young. And they won. With every planted seed, every laugh shared on the porch swing, every quiet night spent side by side, they rewrote what love looks like. So what can we learn from Eleanor and Jesse? We learn that timing is not destiny, that it's never too late to begin again. Not in love, not in life. We learn that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it's a woman in a blue dress walking alone into a church where her future falls apart, and still finding the grace to stand tall. We learn that love does not always come when we demand it. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet offer from a stranger who sees our worth before we see it ourselves. And most importantly, we learn that real love, the kind that endures storms, that deepens with age, that speaks not with flowers but with folded laundry and extra slices of cornbread, that love is not rare. It's just rarely noticed. Today, in a world still obsessed with perfection, Eleanor's story reminds us of the power of presence, of kindness, of showing up for someone not because they're flawless, but because they're real. So, if you've ever felt too late, too weathered, too overlooked, let Eleanor show you otherwise. Let Jessie remind you that choosing someone is not about rescuing them. It's about recognizing them. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that you're never too old to hope, never too scarred to be loved, never too late to live fully, then help us continue sharing stories like this. Subscribe to Wild West Legends. Your support fuels more than just content. It fuels a movement, a belief that everyone deserves to be seen, that every chapter, even the later ones, can be the most beautiful of all. Because out here, where the wind still whispers across the plains, where lives unfold quietly but powerfully, every story matters, and every heart, no matter how long it's waited, deserves a home. Thank you for walking this journey with us. Until next time, be bold, be kind, and believe in love that lasts.